Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today, we're very excited to have Claire McCleskey, first-time guest on the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
And also, one of our regulars is back, Collmann Griffin. Welcome back, Collmann.
Hey, folks.
And as I said, we're very excited to have Claire. Claire recently left OFAC, where she was, I think, were you the head of compliance? I can't remember your exact title, but head of compliance, I think. And I was lucky enough to work with Claire on some matters, as she was our observation from the outside was she was an incredibly dedicated public servant, exactly what you would want your government to do. And now she is outside of OFAC and in a position in why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now, Claire?
Sure. Thanks so much. So right now I'm just doing some independent sanctions consulting, mostly focused on the shipping and insurance industry, since that's what I dealt with a lot while at OFAC, but sort of figuring out the plan for what I'll be doing next.
Great. And Collmann, what are you doing now?
Much less, I was going to say much less exciting, but that's not true at all, Tim.
Hear it.
So Claire and I overlapped at OFAC, and since then I've joined Mill & Chevalier, where I work with Tim every day.
Excellent. Well, what we wanted to have you on the pod to talk a little bit about sanctions and shipping, Claire, because we know that is one of your areas of expertise, and it is an issue that comes up a lot for clients that we have, kind of not only in the shipping sector, but in the insurance sector and in other financial sectors that provide support services to folks that are in the shipping industry. And so essentially, in the shipping space, one of the things that the clients look for in terms of compliance is just through kind of screening and list-based compliance. But why don't you talk a little bit more about some of the risks that come up that you've seen in the shipping industry, and we can talk then maybe program by program, because I know that there's different risks depending upon which program you're dealing with.
Sure. I think at a very high level, there's a couple things that are particularly challenging for the shipping industry. I think number one is just the number of entities that are often involved in a particular transaction and the complexity of some of those entities. So, even in a completely above board shipping transaction, you might have multiple SPV, you might have complex leaseback arrangements, right, with a lot of parties. You'll have banks involved doing the financing, could have hedge funds. And each of those actors will have, which we can get into, a different risk appetite, a different approach. They might be based in different jurisdictions. And so what ends up happening is that transactions can get really complicated. And shipping, unlike, banking, for example, doesn't have as much sort of broad regulatory pressure that allows them to just cut off if something is suspicious, right? They often have to prove in a contract there has been a violation of sanctions, or if I completed this transaction, I would violate sanctions or cause someone to violate sanctions. And, as you all know, that's often not what you see. You see a series of red flags, or you can't quite get comfortable with something. And so then if you're going to cut something off, if you're going to actually, call on a particular clause in a contract, or if you're going to just not proceed with a deal, there can be litigation risk. There can just be a lot of commercial pressure. And we often hear from people, in particular, someone saying, well, I have a really great compliance program. I have a really sophisticated set of tools. And I can tell you that the guy down the street, my biggest competitor, they don't do that, right? And so my business people are coming to me and saying, if I don't do this, we're going to lose out. I think it's a little bit of a less level playing field than some other industries. So that can make it really hard for companies that want to do the right thing, when sometimes they can feel like they're sort of a lone voice saying, I'm not comfortable with this. And other people are saying, well, I don't see a problem here.
Yeah, you raise a lot of great points in that. One of the things that I see in shipping is just the complexity with as you said, completely above board companies. So you essentially have, different SPVs often for each vessel, and then you have parties, like when I get these questions, they're often in the form of emails about kind of, can you take a look at this transaction? I have a hard time keeping all the parties straight, even in transactions that are, with major companies that have great compliance programs, the leasebacks and who is going to be the charter party and who is going to be the cargo party. It gets very complex. I mean, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the, you mentioned red flags that can come up in these sorts of transactions that I guess help you separate the complex transactions that are complex for completely legitimate reasons and complex transactions that are complex because people are trying to hide what they're doing, and maybe talk a little bit starting with Iran, but we can move on to some of the other programs as well.
No, it's good timing because I think yesterday there was a big new Iran sanctions action, and the press release from OFAC mentioned that, even just under the Trump administration, OFAC has added 170 vessels under Iran sanctions, and there were hundreds under the Biden administration. I think the Biden administration did, I want to say, like 80 different Iran oil-related actions. And there's a really good wealth of information in that press release and in all the press releases about the typologies and the risk factors. Just to touch base kind of at the outset, since we'll be using the term, talking about Iran, talking about Russia, different groups or organizations or tools will use a different definition for the shadow fleet, right? The IMO uses one basically super broad, saying, are you a ship engaged in illegal operations for the purpose of circumventing sanctions or evading compliance with safety or environmental regulations or insurance costs? People will use different definitions, sometimes say the gray fleet, right? It's ambiguous. The dark fleet, they're definitely engaged in deceptive shipping for the purpose of evading sanctions. When it comes to Iran, though, I mean, what really strikes me when you read these press releases about the actions, how much is, yes, they are evolving, they're getting more sophisticated, there's more complexity, the scale, but it's also kind of the same old in some ways in terms of the deceptive practices, because a lot of them still work and they're still really difficult for, I think, legitimate actors to often detect. The very sort of simple, straightforward one that's mentioned a lot in this press release in particular is, abnormalities with the AIS. I think what's really challenging, I mean, this is a little trite, is that, AIS was primarily developed as a safety mechanism for ships not to run into each other, right? It wasn't developed to be a sanctions compliance tool to tell someone exactly where someone is at any minute and to use that historical data. And of course, we know that there's a lot of legitimate reasons that someone might want to disable their AIS, under the guidance from the relevant maritime authority during the Red Sea crisis. There may have been times when, for safety purposes, someone wanted to disable their AIS. I think what OFAC has recommended is that there's a couple scenarios in which, AIS manipulation is a very clear red flag. One would be AIS manipulation coupled with a particular area. Some of the recent shipping guidance from OFAC calls out, for example, the coast of Malaysia as a very high risk area, off the coast of Oman. So certainly, if you see that you're dealing with a vessel that has a history of AIS manipulation in those areas, that is a reason to, try and get some additional information or ask some additional questions. Especially when you then add on top of that, okay, we're seeing AIS manipulation, and we're also seeing that this vessel has a history of multiple STS transfers. And ship-to-ship transfers have obviously legitimate usages, but particularly on the Iran space, we're seeing, a chain of 4 or 5 ship-to-ship transfers. And there's really, I don't want to say never, but I certainly can't fathom a commercial reason that you'd want to do that many ship-to-ship transfers back to back. And so we often see that in the Iranian shadow fleet. Similarly with changing names, being registered with companies that have just popped up. Some of the things that we see on the Iran front.
So those are some of the factors that I think you touched on, that I think that um, it's important from a compliance perspective to look at one factor plus. So, for example, looking at the AIS can do weird things just because it does weird things sometimes. And sometimes it can do weird things because people are doing weird things with the AIS. And so where is the ship when the AIS is malfunctioning? Is the ship on a particular route and then all of a sudden it's on the other side of the world and it stays on the other side of the world, or then it comes back, or the sorts of things that, at least when we're trying to help clients with compliance, we're looking for with the AIS, because we found weird AIS bugs that don't seem to indicate much. And as you said, turning off the AIS sometimes has there's a completely legitimate basis for it, and sometimes there's just not. In the same way with STS transfers, I think that the multiple STS transfers for no apparent commercial reason seems to be a really good thing to look for, because on the other hand, we've had clients who are kind of fishing boats out in the middle of nowhere where there's really not a lot of diversion action going on, but the fishing boats are out there for 6 months and they need STS transfers to refuel. And so those sorts of STS transfers, generally, at least when we're looking at them, don't seem to present much risk. You mentioned the shadow fleet, and I hear that often talked about as the shadow fleet, but are there different shadow fleets that kind of specialize in Iran as opposed to Russia, as opposed to DPRK, or is it basically these ships are kind of off the grid and are doing business in lots of different regions?
I mean, this is where I think you see different groups that have different definitions, and it's definitely not sort of a monolith. We do see some overlap, and you can even see, for example, sometimes in designations that there's a couple designations this year where, the EU has designated, or the UK has designated certain vessels for Russia-related activity, and those same vessels have been designated by OFAC for Iran-related activity, which suggests that they're doing these different types of businesses. I think that the thing that sometimes I think people get the impression that somehow there's like a group of companies that just service, quote, the shadow fleet, and they just sit there and they sort of
Variously.
to break sanctions, which I don't think is how it works. I think the difference is, or the connecting tissue can be some of the ship management companies, some of the brokers. If you are making your money off of a vessel being employed, and particularly if it's a time period where freight rates are super, super high, meaning each fixture you're going to make a lot of money, then your incentive is just to make sure that that vessel is on hire as much as possible, right? So I think that's where you get a lot of the overlap. I think what is challenging, what I have heard from, is when it comes to a really rigid definition of the shadow fleet, of saying, okay, well, we're going to say that if it doesn't have Western P&I, right, now it's the shadow fleet. Well, that can be challenging, right? Because there are a lot of non-IG P&I clubs that, if someone's a member, that's basically an indication that something really seriously wrong is going on, right? But this is where we talk about kind of the gray fleet, which is vessel or companies that maybe they made a mistake. They've had one tanker sanctioned, right? Now they're losing services because legitimate actors are saying, well, they've had a tanker sanctioned, I don't want to deal with them. And you can kind of have people like pushed out of the legitimate fleet, which can be a problem. But I mean, generally speaking, like there are certain indicators in terms of the insurance cover, the age of the vessel, the safety record, we haven't talked as much about like the flag state, that are an indication that, a vessel is a lot higher risk. And certainly that is how, like, we know that the EU is thinking about it, the UK is thinking about it. The EU in particular, unlike OFAC, for example, has certain authorities or capabilities related to specifically the shadow fleet. So definitely can be really high risk.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions about insurance. So it's my impression that U.S. insurers, but more often it's UK insurers or EU insurers with these fleets. Their compliances and their attention to potential sanctions issues has gone way up in the last 3 to 4 years. And in many ways, that's a good thing. But to the extent that there are companies that, have some problems but are trying to comply, and not the companies that are the shipping companies that are basically just decided we're going to do whatever business we can take, and the sanctioned business pays best, so we're going to go focus on sanctioned business. But companies that, as you said, might have made one mistake, if those companies kind of get pushed out of the EU Western insurance systems or EU UK Western insurance systems, I would think that the worry that I would have is that there's less visibility from the EU UK side into those shipping systems. I mean, is that a real issue? Do the P&I clubs help bring more visibility to agencies like OFAC, or is it just the visibility from the P&I clubs isn't really helpful or harmful either way?
I think this is definitely a big concern of industry. I think this has been something that industry, has raised with the different, relevant governments. Certainly going back as far as Max Pressure 1, but definitely during the development of the price cap. I mean, this was part of the rationale behind the development of the price cap, was in addition to, the need to keep Russian oil flowing but reduce the benefit that was going back to Russia. I think industry, made an argument that, okay, there is a benefit to, this trade being done on premier Western services. There's a safety issue, right? Shipping oil is maritime shipping of oil is an activity that's not without risk, right, to the environment. And so definitely, the industry has expressed a lot of concern of, hey, what happens if there's an accident somewhere, right? And they are not actually backed by legitimate P&I, and so they're not able to get a payout for that, right? And that the impact to that, right? For folks that aren't aware, a P&I club exists, right, not to pay back the ship owner in the case of an incident, but to pay back third parties that are damaged. So, for example, coastal communities in the event of an oil spill, right? And so, the other concern that we hear from P&I clubs and other actors is, all right, what's the kind of end game once someone's in the shadow fleet, right? How do you get it scrapped in a safe way? How do you get it sold to someone that's going to scrap it safely? Forget scrapping it in the sort of premium, most environmentally friendly way, but just getting them to scrap it at all and not simply abandon it somewhere, right? Or, seafarer abandonment this year is very high. Situations where someone just says, we're going to leave the vessel, we're not going to pay, the seafarers, we're not going to help them get home, we're just going to leave it and see it off, basically. I think those are big concerns, and it's why, I mean, you've seen, countries that have kind of choke points or are vulnerable on their coast take more action. Something the UK is very interested in, something the Baltic states are interested in. It's very complicated, right, because of the freedom of navigation and the intersection with other laws. But absolutely, it's something that for years, industry has been saying, hey, we've got these vessels, they're really old, they've been on the water for forever. What's the end of life plan for them?
End of life plan is really something that comes up a lot, is these vessels, trying to kind of take vessels off the grid that are not functioning, but the costs of actually either making them safe or retiring them is high enough that you just hear a lot of stories about vessels being beached, and which can't be good for anyone, in terms of the environmental consequences, the consequences in terms of the crew and safety. So why don't we talk a little bit about, you talked about the price cap and compliance challenges that kind of led to the price cap in terms of the potential that that essentially allowing the trade to go on, but trying to regulate the trade with respect to a particular price in order to achieve the OFAC's objective or the U.S. foreign policy objective. Has that been successful in kind of curbing some of these issues with respect to, let's say, insurance? Or, how has the price cap worked out in terms of, how you've observed it in terms of what it was designed to do versus what it achieved?
Sure. I mean, I think there was a lot of participation in the price cap up until very recently. For example, I saw there was some reporting just I think last week about after the recent sanctions on the two additional Russian oil majors by the U.S. Some of the Greek ship owners, dropping out that had previously been doing presumably price cap compliant trade, right? Given that they're located in the EU. I think the challenge is, one, as I mentioned, the sanctions on the oil majors, there was a transition from the primary strategy against Russian energy was the price cap, and then sanctions sort of enforcing the price cap right on these pop-up traders or opaque networks or someone that had actually violated the price cap, to more direct pressure on Russian oil majors, right? So in January, we saw some sanctions. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, the last couple of weeks are honestly a blur since those sanctions came out, but additional sanctions. And so that makes compliance even more challenging, right? Those are the people that are selling the oil to or are using the traders to place that oil on the market. And so I think you've seen more withdrawal from the price cap in light of those designations as folks figure out how are we going to comply with that in a meaningful way, because you can be compliant with the price cap, that's great, and there's still a straight up blocking prohibition right on those entities, which makes it more complicated. Just to give sort of a shout out to the UK, there's a GIMLIT report, which is I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but they're public-private partnership sort of task force they have, and a couple agencies put out a report in July 2025 on a particular Russia sanctions evasion network and maybe price cap evasion network that I think is really interesting and is indicative of the way that we've seen these Russian networks do business, place their oil, find tankers to take it to India or take it to China.
And India and China, I'm assuming, are kind of the major hubs for price cap evasion, where essentially you've got companies in India buying the oil without compliance with the price cap. Are there, is there documentation that is then created that doesn't reflect the actual price? What's the mechanism that you're seeing in terms of
I think what's complicated on the Russia front is that the way that since the war and before the war, actually to a certain extent, the way that Russia sells its oil is via these foreign trading companies, right? So it's not like if I'm a refiner in India or I'm a large importer, I go directly to Lukoil or whoever else, right, and say I'd like a contract for this much oil, right? I would have to deal with a company in Dubai, who would be the intermediary for me. And so because of the price cap, as intended at each stage, as you need to get price information if you would normally have price information in the ordinary course of business versus an insurer, right? They're not going to have that price information. And so that's why we saw this whole network, and there's been a lot of open source reporting about this. OFAC and the UK and the EU have designated many of these companies. We've seen these network of kind of pop-up traders emerge as the large commodity traders withdrew from doing the Russia business, immediately following the invasion. So I think that is what's, can often be challenging for folks that are sort of one step removed, as it is very opaque a lot of the times.
It's whoever is dealing directly with the Russian majors is going to be the only one that has a really firm grasp on the price. And if that chain, if that link is problematic, it seems like it'd be very hard for anybody else downstream to figure that out.
Yes. Obviously, if you're the buyer, I think it's, The other thing we haven't really touched on now is that, of course, there's a divergence in the price cap, right?
Right.
So the United States hasn't lowered the price cap, but the UK and the EU, other members of the coalition, they have pushed the price cap down. And so, you know, now I believe it's 40 is the
Right.
EU UK price, could be 45. Don't hold me to that. But it's much lower than the US one, and it's is lower than at the time, certainly.
Right. I think it was
Russian oil was
the
actually
price cap in
trading
the U.S. is like, is it 65?
60,
60?
65. I should really,
Well, I mean,
how quickly you
I
right.
figured you'd have that tattooed on you by
jettison
now,
this
Claire.
information on my brain.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit more about, I mean, because, there is a lot of EU-U.S. divergence at this point. I mean, not only on the price cap, but, U.S. sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft have kind of kicked in at this point, or at least the wind down license, I think, expired at midnight last night, at least one of them. And so the U.S. has blocking policies with respect to these companies. The EU and the UK have slightly different versions and also different wind down periods and different price caps. I mean, this is very new. It's really only a creature of the last year, because until the last year, it did seem like the U.S., the EU, and the UK were kind of working in lockstep and making joint announcements, and the policies, were mostly the same. Given that the EU has kind of a difficult time adopting measures and passing measures, since it needs all 27 member states to be unanimous. But what are you seeing in terms of this divergence? Is this creating more challenges? I mean, I'm sure it is, but what types of challenges have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, so the UK has not listed Lukoil, unlike the US or sorry, the EU has not listed Lukoil, unlike the US and the UK. They have in the past taken action, for example, against, I think, Latasco Shipping DMCC, and the stated reason that it was Lukoil's primary shadow fleet enabler. But, the reason that they haven't sanctioned Lukoil is because of the amount of Lukoil assets in Europe and the importance to the European supply chain for gasoline and for oil. So I think that what we hear, from companies is that they're the most concerned about the United States sanctions, right? Because of the secondary sanctions implication, even if someone has no US jurisdiction. And then, of course, they're concerned about sanctions in the jurisdiction where they operate for the UK and the EU. I think what's changed a little recently is people have started to see what they call outside of jurisdiction approach by the EU in terms of designating companies for engaging in business with Russia, even when there's not necessarily an EU touch point. And then the other thing is just the kind of borderline conflict of law issues, right? If you are dealing with a company in Europe that is, able to take advantage of one of the US general licenses, there's not a matching general license in the UK. I think for companies that are caught up in these issues, it still can be very worthwhile to actually reach out directly, particularly to OFAC, and just try to get, guidance, because in this area, while there may be some very kind of technical misalignment, which can cause big headaches, there is broad alignment among the three, right? That they have gone after Russian oil majors, which I think makes it easier from a policy perspective. For many years, there were so many issues, right, with Iran, where there was really big misalignment. And that's changed with the E3 snapback. It doesn't mean that the sanctions are perfectly aligned among, the EU, the UK, and the US on Iran. They're very much not. But I think we're in a different area now than we were, which makes it easier when there is a acute conflict of law situation, that at least there's some sort of broader policy alignment.
Right. There's still no blocking law blocking the Russian sanctions that we put into place like there was. And really, the blocking statute in the EU is very watered down, except when it comes to Cuba at this point. But still, I would think that it did appear to me that there was some coordination going on, but also some kind of disruption of EU businesses that were linked to Rosneft. It did seem like there was a little bit of a plan to try and ease the pain by cutting off some of the Rosneft subsidiaries, for example. I think there was a general license with respect to the German subsidiary. There's been some talk about, I think the Bulgarian subsidiary was maybe divested. I can't remember exactly how they did it. But anything in terms of, that level of coordination that you're seeing with respect to trying to ease the pain on the EU side, apart from that, or ease the pain on the UK side or on the US side? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of coordination to try and make sure that the brunt of the sanctions are felt in Russia and not in the EU, to the extent that that's possible?
I mean, first of all, obviously, I think they've had plenty of notice, right? I mean, certainly, I think that doesn't necessarily make it easier when you're talking about real assets, right? That people depend on and where people are employed, or, if they're not available, there's going to be an energy price spike, right? As we're going into the winter, like, don't mean to minimize that, but I think at this point in the war, right, if you're dealing with a Russian supplier, you're in a Russian supply chain, you're aware that at some point, with very little notice, right, things could very much change. I mean, I think that the general licenses you've seen, both from the UK and the US, speak to that kind of, business as usual coordination and mitigation that OFAC and OFC do when they hear about really acute issues or people that need additional time to, wind down contracts or figure out alternative arrangements. Particularly, as you noted, in scenarios in which there's going to be some kind of default or something that the European entity is going to be the loser, the Russian entity is going to be the winner. I think that Treasury and OFSI, not to speak on OFSI's behalf, but are attentive to that. And, the fact that we've seen these licenses shows that this is something that they are continuing to prioritize, even if it doesn't mean that they're going to go, choose that at the expense of letting the sanctions bite. I think Treasury's public messaging on this has been that they want these sanctions to really hit.
Got it. You also mentioned, in terms of shipping, flag registries. And my sense was, in the past really year, that the flag registries have gotten a lot more aggressive about kind of affirmatively reaching out to shipping companies and ship owners about potential issues with respect to their vessels, and in some cases deflagging, some cases with very short notice deflagging. What are you seeing in terms of the shipping registries and their compliance?
I think flag states have gotten a lot of attention, both from governments and from different, intelligence providers, commercial providers, and non-governmental organizations. RUSI in particular has a maritime task force, and they devoted a large chunk of their most recent report. It was devoted to flag states and to insurers, and they have made certain recommendations about flag states, which I think are very, very reasonable. What's really challenging about flag states, right, is that under UNCLOS, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, they are responsible for compliance with safety and environmental and insurance standards, right? And so they have to have jurisdiction over any ship that's flying their flag, but there's really no practical enforcement mechanism that's part of UNCLOS. And obviously these flags are competing, right? It's often a money-making exercise for the countries that have active flag registries. So I think we've seen a couple things happen. One is there's been, as I mentioned, a lot of outreach by governments, whether the UK, or the United States, to different registries to say, hey, what's going on? We're seeing a lot of shadow fleet activity in your jurisdiction. And so there have been some shifts in, I think some governments, frankly, it's an outside company that goes and sets it up. It's not even located in the country, or they don't have any connection to the particular country. And I think when they get that outreach from the United States government, they say, okay, not worth, juice not worth squeeze, our bad, never mind, wrap it up. And then you see like straight up false flag. I mean, there are registries that have been created, for example, where the actual government says that is not us. That has no affiliation with us. This is just some enterprising person that set it up, in Dubai or wherever else, or the Seychelles, and says, we're going to run a flag registry, right? I think even for very sophisticated flag registries, right? If you put aside the false flags and the really sort of worst of the worst, it can be really challenging, right? You're at any point, you have all these registered ships, they're all over the world, they're engaged in all kinds of transactions, right? And you're trying to basically make sure that they don't do anything wrong, they don't violate US sanctions, that they are up, holding to the standard you've set for them. I think that flag registries, the sort of, I don't know if to say good or bad, but the ones that really care about compliance, they have also stepped up and also done some educating back, to governments about here's what we do and do not have. We have, for example, LRIT data, which other people don't have access to, which is better than AIS in terms of determining where a vessel was. But I think that they have tried to say, we can't apply the sort of monitoring approach that maybe government folks are used to in a banking context to shipping. I think some of the recommendations, for example, I think the RUSI Maritime Task Force, they recommended, well, could the FATF actually incorporate a country's flag registry and the standards that they operate under into their mutual evaluation or into sort of FATF oversight, and say that if a country is operating a flag registry that is allowing a lot of shadow fleet activity, that would really count against them when it came to their FATF rating, which I think is a really interesting idea because countries really care about that, right? And that really impacts their banking sector a lot.
So essentially tying the flagging to the banking sector, which is, countries do care quite a bit about the FATF rating.
Yeah.
And any idea how far along that's gotten?
I think it's underway. I don't think, FATF operates on a pretty long timeline, right? And has pretty set kind of milestones. But I think even the introduction of that idea, frankly, helps to sort of spur countries, particularly countries with large flag registries. You're not going to get, the hard thing is, right, I think there's a little bit sometimes I've spoken about this with some industry folks. Sometimes these are flag registries that are tied to a very poor country, right? That's already not super tied into the international financial system. They don't have a sophisticated banking sector. This is a way for the government to make a little bit of money. There could even, be corruption involved. And so it's very hard, I think, for those kind of entities, I think you have to go at it of other actors dealing with those ships have to use available tools to say this is really a very poor flag, right? There's resources that people can access that can tell you, like, is this a good flag, right? Do they have a good rating? Are the ships that they are registering safe? And so I think that's been, the other effort on the government side is to advocate for people to actually stop dealing with vessels if they are flagged by certain states.
Got it. Collmann, you've been awfully quiet. So two questions for you. One is, talk a little bit about.
I've been thinking about my plans to go set up a fake flag registry in Dubai.
Well, that actually was where I was going.
Okay.
So why don't you talk a little bit about, because Claire mentioned kind of front companies and how they and in connection with the oil trade, and that at least what I was hearing was front companies that kind of change relatively rapidly, so it's somewhat hard to keep up with them. why don't you talk a little bit about that from the Russia side and what you were seeing, in connection with Russia in terms of front companies and how anything, other than just kind of the normal, a company's created as a front company so that it can operate without scrutiny and make it very difficult to determine who owns it. Like, what other things were you seeing in connection with Russia that were unusual and kind of people who are trying to comply with Russia sanctions should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me personally, what comes to mind immediately is I feel like I know the flags, like the red flags for like a front company that's buying chips for Russian weapons. Like I feel like I've seen those a bunch of times, like the AI generated website, the sister site in Russia, the your web browser trips up on a Russian geolocation, stuff like that. Um, I'm actually not sure what would be, like, off the top of my head, what would be a sort of indicia of a front company that would be used to conceal a sort of bad actor in the shipping sector that's servicing Russia. I mean, I think Dubai comes to mind, but there's just so much
You're
legitimate.
always so hard on Dubai, Collmann.
Claire, Tim keeps being like, Collmann, you got to give Dubai a chance. But there's so much legitimate business in Dubai, but there's also illegitimate business in Dubai. And I could, when Claire said that, she mentioned sort of some of these front companies are set up in Dubai. Of course that makes sense. But I wouldn't know exactly what to look for. And then the other thing that's difficult that I've sort of been coming to realize is how often, for legitimate reasons, a single vessel is owned by a single company, which can be really hard. You find the vessel, you look up who owns it. It's one company. You try to understand the ownership. It's maybe another company. There's a director you've never heard of. It's just a little bit tougher there, from my perspective.
Yeah, and it's hard to figure out kind of which ones are doing something or setting up an ownership system like that to try and hide things, because there's, at least as I understand it, there's a legitimate, insurance and liability reason to set up a company to own a vessel, because you essentially do not want one company owning a bunch of vessels because they take on so much liability, and you don't want one vessel to have an accident and then they can get all the other vessels, so that somebody can sue them and easily get all the other vessels. Is essentially as I understand it. And so that strikes me as something that, and I've seen it, a lot of legit companies do, but it also is a way to kind of hide ownership. And so I've always been puzzled at how you try to distinguish between the people who are trying to set up complex structures as an evasion tool and people who set up complex structures as a liability limitation tool.
Yeah, and the other challenge for me is, for me, like, if you can find evidence of a single shipment of, like chips or some other weapons component to Russia, to me that's game over. We're not doing business with them. But to Claire's point, you do see a lot of players in the shipping industry who have gotten, maybe like one of their vessels got hit, because they weren't careful and they were trying to rent it out as much as possible, and then it got used by the Iranians, or maybe the Russians, to deliver some oil, and based on AIS, OFAC was able to tag it. But it is hard to know then, is this just a company that made a mistake and could do better, or is this a company that is, connected with the Iranian petrochemical company and just got caught once? It's kind of a tricky world out there.
Tricky world out there. Speaking of a tricky world out there, let's close on FTOs and cartels. We've talked about this on the podcast before. It's a big topic because I think the President Trump's focus in foreign policy seems to be among other places, really focused on Latin America and cartels, and particularly in Mexico, but there are other places in Latin America as well. Many of these cartels have been designated now as foreign terrorist organizations. Can why don't you start, Collmann, and then Claire, why don't you jump in to talk about how that makes compliance even more difficult, and maybe the differences between the FTO programs and kind of just the run-of-the-mill regular OFAC sanctions programs.
Yeah, that's a really so this is, there does seem to be a lot of overlap between kind of the folks who need to be worried about FTOs and the folks who need to be worried about shipping. Maybe not flag states, but definitely insurers and other service providers. I think the big takeaway that I'm realizing is that a lot of folks are forced to make payments where they suddenly realize that there's a cartel nexus. And I think because these cartels, I mean, a lot of them were SDGTs, but the enforcement wasn't as high. There weren't FTOs. There wasn't this sort of additional criminal liability. So a lot of companies, maybe they didn't do the due diligence on the front end, and then they ended up in a relationship with a company that has ties to the cartels in a jurisdiction where the cartels are just interwoven into society. And so I think you want to get to you don't want to be in a position where you realize that you have a cartel link when you're forced to make an extortion payment. Like you want to try to know as far in advance the risks of a particular business partner, especially in Mexico, other Latin American countries, and you want to just avoid at all costs getting yourself in a situation where you could be having to make a payment, because when all of a sudden I mean, this is something that we've seen is like a client's employees, they're hanging out, and then somebody drives by and puts bags on their heads and takes them to an undisclosed location and says, you have to make this payment. Like, that's a bad situation to be in, and you want to avoid that situation if at all possible through due diligence.
Words to live by.
Yeah.
Claire, what are some of the special risks that the FTO designations pose for people in the shipping industry? Because I know there have been a lot of, at least there's been one kind of high-profile seizure that I've seen, but can you talk a little bit about some of those extra risks now that there's a lot more FTOs in Latin America than there were a year ago?
Sure. I think this is a real area of concern for the shipping and insurance industry. I mean, I think there's, on the insurance side, for example, the implications for kidnapping and ransom policies, right? And what does it mean to then reimburse someone for a payment that's made that goes to, a cartel that's designated as an FTO. Right now, you're dealing with more the situation of when people are taken hostage by a designated, terrorist organization, which obviously is not new, but just is different. I've talked, for example, to ship owners or other folks that say, well, I don't operate in Russia or the Middle East, and I don't touch Venezuela, so I don't really need to think about sanctions. I'm just in Latin America, and that's my risk profile. There was, for example, a big story in Reuters a couple weeks ago about, I think it was a CJ&G getting involved in fuel smuggling. So they were doing that entirely because it's basically, tax evasion that you can make a profit off of. But the story went through, they were chartering a vessel, right? They were buying the oil, I believe, from Canada. So these are all like sort of very legitimate service providers, right? But they're finding out, okay, the person that actually contracted this was a drug cartel. Similarly, I've seen statements by Treasury and press releases where they say this port in Mexico is controlled by this designated drug trafficking organization. Well, what does that mean if you own a warehouse there, or you take your vessel there, or you offload there, or maybe you actually own the port partially, right, through some kind of arrangement? I think in those scenarios where you have companies like Collmann said that aren't as used to thinking about sanctions, they may need to do kind of a back to basics, right? make sure they have the right clauses and the right things in their contracts. Do they have the ability to request additional documentation? Have they done the due diligence at the outset? We've talked a lot, over the last hour about how onerous KYC can be in the shipping world because this is an inherently opaque industry, right? Like traders make money because other people don't know the price that they've managed to get, right? I think a lot of companies, can you prepare for the headline risk, right? Of something accusing you of like working, supporting narco terrorism or whatever. Hopefully you can by having the right KYC and not getting into relationships with people, but maybe you can't, right? You can't be perfect. Things get through. It's a complicated environment. And in that case, are you ready for the civil enforcement risk, right? Which is, did you have a compliance program in place? Did you put the right resources? Did you have the right controls so that you can say to OFAC, well, yes, it was revealed that this, company was in fact working for this cartel, but I had done everything, humanly possible to make sure that I understood who I was doing business with.
Yeah. I think that's a really good. Imagine yourself someday having to go to OFAC because you've got a banking partner or something that's involved. Are you really going to be able to tell a good story for why you have to?
Well,
do it?
and I think just the idea of having to tell a story to the U.S. is new, right? Because the cartels have been in Mexico forever, but it was a Mexican enforcement risk. It was a safety to your employees risk. It was not a U.S. risk. At least I don't think that it was perceived that way. But now, it's kind of like foreign corruption. 25 years ago, it was perceived as bad locally, but it wasn't something that the U.S. was unusually interested in, at least in terms of the programs and the infrastructure so far. This does seem like it's a big U.S. enforcement priority, which means that, companies that used to think when they were in Mexico they had no U.S. enforcement risk, other than if they had a U.S. nexus dealing with some sort of, sanctioned party, which is pretty manageable in terms of risk, but now the U.S. nexus part of it is a lot less important, or at least has become something that is to consider. But even without a U.S. nexus, you still have a lot of risk. You just have U.S. risk in Mexico and in other places where there's lots of FTOs that we've never had before. And I to Claire's point, I think companies have not started to reckon with this yet because they think of, it's Mexico, it's cartels. We deal with that risk. We've been dealing it for a long time, but what does that have to do with my compliance program from a global perspective? And it's new, but I think it does.
Especially where there's so much supply chain integration, even like on the fuel side, Mexico imports like 70% of its gasoline and diesel, and of that, I think like 90% comes from the United States. So, if you're one of those exporters from the United States, and later there's some headline about, the involvement of a cartel in that supply chain, it's to your point, Tim, it's not something you would have ever thought about, right? Certainly from a sanctions perspective, it would have been a physical safety issue. So I think it's really a whole new world for people, and it not just a priority for this administration, but OFAC, was it last year, changed the statute of limitations to 10 years. So it just makes it a lot more complicated.
Yep. Well, with that, and we're at the hour mark, Claire, why don't you leave us with any parting thoughts in terms of the shipping industry compliance and where we are now and where we're headed? So very open-ended.
Oh, well, I think I've said this before, but in some ways, shipping is better prepared than some industries, or at least some parts of the shipping industry are better prepared to deal with uncertainty, because the uncertainty for them started, after the invasion, or it started going back to max pressure one. And so I think a shipping a company in the shipping industry that has already invested in compliance and that understands the risk is in a good position to be flexible if administration priorities change or if big new sanctions are rolled out or something is rolled back. But I think conversely, for companies that haven't invested or that have thought that it's not relevant, the risk is really, really high that they could end up with one of their vessels designated, that they can end up with a huge counterparty designated and really not be able to extricate themselves, that they could, build a vessel and have the person who order it get designated. So I think that at OFAC, I used to see, I think in shipping more than other industries, just wild levels of differing sophistication that really wasn't dependent on even the size or sophistication of the company itself when it came to sanctions and what their compliance program looked like. So I think, people, ignore sanctions risk at your peril in the shipping industry.
Words to live by. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
And Collmann, thanks again, as always. And for those who are, for our listeners, stay sanctions free, everybody.
Produced by Heartcast Media.